Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the aBlogtoWatch Superlative Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Greg Petronzi. He is the founder of True Patina. He is a watchmaker and a psychologist, amongst other things. Greg, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
One of the things which I find so common in our space is that to be obsessed with watches, you often are not only obsessed with other things, but some of those obsessions come first. Like watches are one obsession in a line of many. Would you say that accurately categorizes yourself?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I don't know if there are other things that came first. It's funny when I look back at my life. There's pictures of me as a child with a watch on. You know, like I always had a watch. It was the Mickey Mouse watch. There was a Swatch, early on. And my middle school days, I was obsessed with this one Swatch where it was like a see-through case and you could see the movement in the auto. And I just always thought that was like the most fascinating thing. And the funny thing is that fascination never really left. It's still there, it's still quite there. But also, yeah, I'm into other stuff that I think a lot of watch guys are into: cars, motorcycles, everyday carry knives.
What's the common theme that connects all those things, or is there one?
That's a good question. I think that, we could sort of speculate about this, but, is there sort of something intrinsic to men? And is there some male archetypal thing happening with respect to, interests in machinery and tools? And certainly I think in that respect, as a watch enthusiast and collector, I do gravitate towards like tool watches, really purpose-built, instruments. But that said, I don't know. I think that there's some sort of an idea of, like, for me, with respect to watches, at least, there's like this intersection between the artistic and the mechanistic, these two different components that seem to come together and in a way sort of come alive. I think that watches, car guys talk about this too, that there's sort of a soul in cars, in a way. And it's not just this inanimate object. We sort of become, we become sort of passionate about these things. And in a way, they start to have, these things start to have personalities of themselves. And in a way, those personalities kind of are reflections of our own. So I think that what's interesting about them, all of them, whether it's fashion or whatever it is that a person's into, I think there's overlaps in sort of the things that we come to really value about those things.
Thank you for that insight. I mainly agree. Would you like to hear my sort of own conclusion and how it overlaps with yours?
Sure, of course.
So I'm glad you said the word tool, because I think it really does boil down to almost a fetishization around the tool. Mm-hmm. I can't speak for women because I think they process this a little bit differently. But men are intrinsically interested in things in our environment that give us more power. Mm. And those things not only give us more power, but oftentimes they are created by our own society. So as you said, there's that dual dimension. There is the cultural dimension of other humans like me had to think about this and put this together and also use it. And then this item lets me do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do without it. And I think with watches, amongst other things like, diving deep underwater, our bodies are terrible at telling the time. As you know, time is quite relativistic in also a psychological sense. I don't want to speak for psychologists, but as they know, when you're having a good time seems to fly. When you're having a bad time, things seem to slow. And having this consistency of one measurable standard that we all agree to offers us to the ability to interact as an organized society. Whereas if we're all relying on our own sense of time, nobody'd be able to coordinate on anything.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that I think is so amazing about watches to me is like, what is time in and of itself? It's such a, it's a metaphysical construct, really.
Oh, I could go into this at length. Right? Don't open up this can of worms.
We could go deep into that, right? And I think now all of a sudden you have this instrument on your wrist that's measuring this thing that relates to the passing of moments, and also, what I like so much about watches in particular is that there's an element to me, specifically when it comes to mechanical watches, where the power that is generated to make them move is imparted to them by us, the wearers, whether it's winding them up manually or whether it's wearing them with an automatic device. To me, there's something really special about that, because then the timepiece actually becomes an extension of our own life force, and by proxy, an extension of our own health. I had a really good friend of mine that has since passed years ago.
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you. He was really cool. He was a great watch guy. We actually met via watches, and he when he became ill, his interest in watches really sort of dwindled. And I think it made sense. There was something about that really did. I totally understood. It's like when he wasn't able to move around as much and he wasn't able to enjoy life, then it was sort of like, well, these luxury things that we get to experience with respect to watches, all of a sudden they didn't really mean anything to him anymore. So sometimes I think about the watches that I have and I look at them and I think, this is actually really just also when I look at these watches, I think this is a representation of how fortunate I am to just be able to get up and move around. Well,
let's look into that. The pursuit of watches as a hobby is a luxury, and also highly contingent on you being able to not only go out into the world and use that watch, but also show it off to people. So not only at sort of a very crucial point in people's lives when they're ill, do sort of superfluous things seem less interesting. But if you don't go out and have to be on other people's schedules, meaning you're more or less isolated, then knowing the time means less because there's less coordination to do.
Yeah. There's less coordination.
And I try to remind people, especially when I go to these collectors events and people are taking themselves so serious sometimes, that the fact that you have the interest to be able to go out and essentially play with other men and talk about watches is itself a sign of how nice your life probably is, because busy people who have very, very serious issues on their hands tend to not be able to engage in the hobby. And what we see with collectors who have been doing it in their life, there's sort of on and off periods, right? There's moments where they can be really into it and then they have to withdraw because of like life situations. And then maybe when they have time and focus, they can get back into it. But as is the nature with other hobbies, it's the kind of addiction that thankfully you can scale back when need be.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. I think there's an element, though, and I would add to that, where there's an element sometimes with hobbies, and watches are certainly no exception, where they can also be a nice distraction from the challenges that we do face in life in the day-to-day.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure that I'm not the only person out there, a watch guy, who enjoys sort of the feeling of getting lost in eBay, searching for different watches that might be of interest.
That's like half my life you're describing right there.
Yeah, exactly. There's something very like meditative and therapeutic about it. Like you really just get lost in that process. And what's nice about that too is in those moments, you're not really thinking about the bills you have to pay. I mean, maybe you should be, right? But you're not really thinking about the
bills you're about to pay.
Right, the bills you're about to pay. The things that you have to get done. In those moments, at least for me, I sort of just say, well, I'm just going to zone out. Maybe this is before I go to bed or something like that. And it's a way of sort of decompressing it. Sometimes not even really looking for a specific watch or anything like that. It's just, well, what's out there? What's going on? And I think those are moments too where the enthusiasm is also a reprieve from the day-to-day sort of stressors that sometimes we face. So
I'm glad that you identify it as a hobby, and I do as well. But for the longest time, I never used the word hobby to apply to watch collecting, and that was mainly because the watch industry itself never used the word hobby. And so I'm trying to get more people accustomed to considering it as a hobby in the industry to think about it that way, because it is. I think maybe they feel like that cheapens it. Oh, I mean, luxury can be a hobby. But I'm so glad that you're thinking about that way, because again, for the majority of my career doing this, even though it was a hobby, it's sort of, other than saying collectors, which, that's a hobby, there was really no terminology associated with that. I'd love to know your thoughts on maybe why the watch industry shies away from it seeing itself as a hobby, even though it is very thoroughly a hobby.
Sure. Well, I think it's a good question, right? I mean, hobby, I use that term. I use enthusiast, right? Passionate collector, you name it. For me, they're to an extent sort of interchangeable. But I think possibly it's the case that with hobby, there's a little bit of there can be maybe a little bit of a perceived, maybe a little bit of a perceived sort of
like a stigma, maybe.
Yeah, stigma, right? Like it's just sort of not as serious if it's a hobby. It's like arts and crafts. Not that arts and crafts is not serious, but you know what I mean. Like,
but let's be realistic here. And you know this,
to an artist, and you say, "Do you like arts and crafts?" They'll probably be insulted, right? You know what I mean? It's sort of that thing, and I think when people are very passionate about something, yes, I mean we can call it a hobby, but at the same time, the hobby can also turn into a means of social interaction and experience, which all of a sudden now this is a real an important thing. For instance, too, I mean, in my clinical work as a psychologist, there's a lot of people that once you get out of college, it's hard to meet new people. It's hard to make new friends when you start to get a little bit older. And one of the things that's so amazing about this watch, we'll call it hobby, enthusiasm, what do you want to call it, is that it's actually introduced me to a world of new people that I never would have met otherwise.
Yeah.
And so in that respect, I think there, whatever we want to say, terms we want to put to it, I think it's fine. It's just that I think there is a real powerful sort of thing that can happen when you get really passionate about anything, because you start to meet new people through that. And that can also be a means of really connecting.
Absolutely. And I want to point out that two markets in the world where watches do really well, maybe the best, are also two places thoroughly celebrate the fact that an adult can have a hobby, and that is the United States and Japan. Mm-hmm. Two places where, Japan has basically turned like adults playing with toys into an art form. Okay.
Yes.
And they love watches, incredibly so. And we as well. We have all these stores and Hobby Lobby and all these craft stores and places where you can buy models and things like that. As a child, that was a big part of my life. And in Europe, you don't have that. It's rare. I'm not saying they don't have hobbies in Europe. Of course they do, but it's not celebrated as much. When you go around towns, you don't see the word hobby. No one there talks about things as hobbies. Even if they have skiing, they would never call it a hobby, right? So I think there's a local cultural element in terms of the vernacular used. And because the Europeans that make a lot of the watches we don't use that term, we tend to go with their vocabulary. But the irony is that the consumption of these products is more fervent in the hobby-loving parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Not having spent extensive time outside of the U.S. beyond just a few weeks visiting different places, I can't necessarily say, or speak to any of these other places. From what I know of places like Japan, for instance, they're super passionate when it comes to collecting, when it comes to being enthusiastic about things that have a very fine and, that have to do with craftsmanship and thoughtfulness in their creation. For instance, I have another friend that I've met through the watch world who's actually a psychiatrist, and we talk weekly about Japanese leather jackets, and Japanese denim. That's a whole thing too.
Selvage, baby.
Selvage, yeah. There's a whole thing of overlap there with enthusiasm, right? At the same time, I think the Italians are very big into collecting as well. They've literally nicknamed certain aspects of watches that we come to, refer to. For example, the Longines Tretacche, so 3-notch back is a specific type of Longines. Now, Longines never named it that. That name emerged from the Italian collectors, So there are, from what I understand, there definitely are passionate enthusiasts. Enthusiasm that really does, that is all over the place. But that said, I think there's also probably an extent to which there's an undeniable intrinsic association with the financial capacity to be able to have those enthusiastic sort of capacities. So I don't know. I mean, but it's something interesting to think about.
Look, I spend a lot of my time asking myself why. Why do I like this? Why are we into this? Why do I feel the way I do? Why would I spend this amount on this object, but this object I don't care about? And as someone who has to analyze not only the market, but consumer behavior, I've had to be, an amateur psychologist for a very, very long time. And I think I've done a pretty good job of answering a lot of these questions. But I think consumers like to understand why they might be into something. It helps, when you understand your own behavior, it can probably help you make better decisions around that behavior. So I think it's interesting. And I want to change tack to ask a different question that I actually don't really have a good answer to yet. I'm still pondering it. And that is, why the special interest, not amongst everyone, but in vintage watches? And there's something strange which happens once the watch becomes old enough that's no longer used, but it's vintage, right? I don't know what that separation point is. We'll have to figure that out. But there's a lot of people who have a lot of fondness and interest in vintage watches that there's not paralleled in new watches. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, which you have seen a lot of experience now, what is it that vintage watches have as an element to them that new watches don't, that make them sexier to some people?
They tell time in multiple dimensions.
Okay.
That's it right there for me. That's what it is.
Elaborate.
It's so when you look at a vintage watch, you're not just looking at it right now in the present moment. It's not just telling you what the time is here and now. It's actually telling you what the time was in the moment when it was created. The design language is something that is representative of that time in which it was actually made. The scratches, the scars, the things that are on the case that represent the time past and elapsed, all of that is telling time having been lived. And I think that those two things in particular are something that really go hand in hand with why vintage watches become their own sort of iconic experience in the watch enthusiast world. And that is that they tell time in multiple dimensions. When I look at, for instance, a 1970 Rolex Submariner, I know that that's what was available in 1970 and not anymore, in that sense. So you're looking at a very specific design language that's representative of the time in which it was made. And I think that's super cool, because now all of a sudden it's not just about that timepiece. It's also like a reflection of the era. It's a reflection of watchmaking and horology at that point in time.
That's a great response. I hadn't necessarily considered that way. I mean, that's a good. I think people probably have their own little, takes on that, nuances. But you're right. It is obviously communicating more than this is an instrument you can get right now. It has a lived sense of existence, and you can playfully imagine what that existence was, and that we'll call it a fantasy element has a lot of appeal.
100%. And of course, there's other elements too. I think there's the sense of, this is no longer made, right? So that makes you feel like, well, I can't just go out and get it as easily, even if in fact they did make tons of them, the fact that it's no longer made does give you this immediate sense of rarity, right? And people like things, I think, that feel rare, that's not as common, that's not as easily obtained, right? We like things that are hard to obtain. And
it's funny because we have a whole article series on aBlogtoWatch called "No Longer Made."
Yeah, well, there you
so
go.
I'm glad you used the term.
Right there. I think that's another big part of it. So I think that those two things. It's funny because sometimes vintage guys will say, give it time. All the modern guys, eventually all roads lead to vintage in a way. And I don't know, maybe it's true. I feel like I'm an enthusiast of all watches. I really am. I love modern stuff. I love vintage stuff. But at the end of the day, vintage is still my most, that feels most proximal to my heart, and I feel like the pieces that I own that I really love the most are usually the ones that have not been made for many, many years.
And there's a lot of people that definitely share that perspective. There's an added element of psychology here that is not relegated to just timepieces, but I think it's interesting, and it helps people like you stay in business. And that is that people have this emotional desire to keep old things alive. And they will spend a huge amount of money fixing, repairing, restoring, whatever you want to call it, everything from homes to automobiles to boats to timepieces. And this is a very impractical thing because more often than not, they can just get a newer version of that for less money than it would cost them and less headaches, of course, in repairing it. Yet it's almost as though they see it as a living thing. It's like, I'm going to keep it alive. You're not going to die under my watch. And they impractically spend so much money, again, to do this. And many people listening to this, if they think about it, they're like, oh, I did that. I've totally done that for something. Talk about that, because it's a sort of very strange behavior that I notice.
So I love that you brought this up, because it relates specifically to experiences I've had both as a watchmaker and a motorcycle enthusiast.
Right.
Where I'm going with this is that I once had a motorcycle called a Ducati 998, and it was my favorite looking bike. It was just gorgeous. And at the time that I owned it, I really wasn't making very much money. And every time I turned around, it felt like I needed to repair the damn bike. There was something wrong with it.
An Italian vehicle that needs repair? What?
Early 2000s, and it was such a nightmare, And I ended up selling it because I got so frustrated with it, Forget this. But also, what else was frustrating is the bike's value just kept going down and down. It's like, it was very incensing as an owner of something that I really liked to also see the value go down and then still need to put work into it. I think what's different about watches is that if you have your watch repaired and repaired properly, the value doesn't go down. The value either stays the same or goes up. And to me, there's a little bit of a distinction there between that and like sort of the automotive world. And now, granted, when you get into collectible cars or collectible bikes, that's a different thing. And at some point or another, the 998 will probably be collectible, and I'll be kicking myself for having sold it. But that said, I recently said this to a friend of mine, because I also have friends in the watch world that are afraid to service their watches because they feel like if you service it, there's some potential incurred risk with it cosmetically, and it might, suffer a mark on the dial or something to that nature and devalue the watch, which is not an unfounded fear, by the way. But what I respond to that with is, would you rather have your preserved, cherished watch, or would you rather have a nice looking paperweight? And the reason I say that is because if you run watches long enough without being cleaned, without being relubricated and oiled and maintained effectively, they sort of tear themselves apart from the inside, the same way a car engine would if you didn't oil it, give it oil every now and then. So, that all that said, I think that there is an element of, wanting to keep these things alive, as we sort of were talking about earlier, this notion that there's a soul to some of these things that we own and are enthusiastic about. But there's also an element of preservation that actually is also a preservation of the value. Nobody at the end of the day is going to want to buy a watch that doesn't work, generally speaking, unless they know that they can get it working, right? And so there is an intrinsically important component about servicing and keeping and maintaining a watch, so that it continues to live on, as it were. And I think that is a little less painful for watch enthusiasts, because as long as it's done correctly, it's going to, again, maintain or increase in value rather, whereas you don't necessarily get that same level of enjoyment. I think with cars and bikes, and initially at least, when you put the miles on, the value goes down. That's not the case with watches, which I love, which is part of what I love so much about watches too. By the way.
You're right. There are some instances where it does spend as much time in the shop, but if you put the work into it, as Greg says, you can get, several good years of wearing enjoyment out of it. You put that money into that old, sports car, and you're back next week.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be very frustrating for the owner,
Absolutely. Now, as a watchmaker, as someone who has pulled back the veil and has sort of seen the nitty gritty of how they're made and had to repair them, we're going to talk a little bit about the company you set up to help create some components for repair.
Sure.
But has that changed your emotion? Is it less sexy now that it's more clinical, or do you think that actually you're deeper into it than someone who doesn't know how they're constructed and know where their strengths and weaknesses are?
I feel like I'm deeper into it now. I think that It has, to an extent, definitely changed my perspective as a collector. So, for example, I just picked up my first Cartier tank from a friend of mine, Mike Nouveau, and he's, I've been I've been trying to avoid the Cartier thing because it's like so like today's, it's like the zeitgeist, it's the fad, everybody's Cartier tank.
The interest bounces around. It
bounces around, and I've been like, resisting it. Anyway, I gave in. I was like, you know what? This actually is a beautiful watch. I want to get one. So in considering which ones to get, I quickly learned that there's, ETA-based movements, and then there's sort of a JLC version based movement out of the 70s. And while arguably the JLC might be nicer looking and better made, the reality is, getting parts for them and servicing might be a little bit more difficult, especially as they're ultra thin, whereas
you want the $10 quartz movement there.
And the ETA-based ones are a lot more easy to maintain, a lot cheaper. And I find myself actually gravitating as a watchmaker towards that because I know, I'll be able to service this for myself very easily without, very much incurred cost or frustration trying to find parts that are long out of production. So yeah, these sorts of things do certainly deepen my understanding and awareness and change the extent to which I sort of view collecting and the things that I look for when I'm trying to look for a new watch or something that I'm enthusiastic about. But yeah, I think it only deepens it because now I get to enjoy watches on multiple different levels, not just their cosmetics, not just the rarity, not just the extent to which they're popular or unpopular, whatever it is. But now I get to also enjoy them for the way in which they were actually made internally. And that's a new way of experiencing watches that really I didn't have the ability to do prior to becoming a watchmaker.
And some of them are really nice when you pull back the veil, and others I'm sure are popular watches that were cheaply made. You're like, I don't see what all the fuss is about.
Yeah, that can happen. Or some watches, I wouldn't even say necessarily cheaply made, but some that maybe their mechanisms were just sort of over-engineered and it, become more of a nightmare to service. And then in that case, it's like, I don't want anything to do with this, Yeah. So yeah, it can be a little eye-opening in different ways.
That brings up an interesting point, and especially someone who's on the front lines of repair, you want to take the work in. Of course, you want to make people happy, but I'm sure sometimes you're like, this isn't worth it. What are some red flags that help you talk somebody off of a cliff? They want to do something silly, like go through repair that just doesn't make sense. How do you identify that? And what do you say to them? You're like, I understand you're in love with this, but please, it's going to break your heart.
I never will discourage someone from trying to service their watch, especially if they are really passionate about it. I understand, too, that there are sentimental pieces out there, things that maybe value-wise, somebody wouldn't look twice at, but because it has a sentimental attachment, then they might want to do anything and everything they can to make it function and run and last for years. And I'm never going to discourage someone from doing that. I will say that for me personally as a watchmaker, there are certainly watches that I turn away. A caliber, for example, that comes to mind is the caliber 390 and the Tudor 7928, which is a wonderfully beautiful reference. It's a gorgeous watch, and I've always kind of even wanted one to an extent, but what always stopped me was the knowledge that the 390 caliber that's inside it is a bit of a nightmare. In terms of servicing and sourcing parts for them. It's not even necessarily that it's a complicated watch. It's just that finding the right parts for them, there's issues with the reversers, all of that stuff is something that prevents me from wanting to take it on as a watchmaker because it becomes more of a burden than it is otherwise worthwhile to do. And as an enthusiast, as it prevents me from being an owner of one because I know, that it's going to be difficult to find the parts that I would need to keep it running. So, that said, there are certainly watches like that, and it really depends on the scarcity of the parts. Really, that's really kind of what it depends on: the scarcity of the parts and the quality of manufacture of the components, and that'll.
How good are some of the aftermarket parts? I mean, I think the context I want to explain here is there are certain times, many times, where you can't get original parts. It's just they're not available. You can't get them, whatever. And if you're lucky enough, there's somebody out there who's made we'll just call them aftermarket parts.
Sure.
How are these parts? I mean, some of them are, of course, terrible, but are there very good aftermarket parts out there that just are just as good, or is it start to get murky once you can't get original parts?
No, there absolutely are aftermarket parts out there that are fantastic. A lot of parts that you can find that are made in Switzerland to specifications of OEM specifications. Sometimes, if they're like a wheel or a gear, things to that nature or opinion, you might need to do a little bit of extra sort of fiddling and broaching or whatever it might be to make it fit exactly the way you want it to. Unshake adjustments, etc. But for the most part, the parts that are out there, you're usually pretty good as long as they're from a Swiss manufacturer. This is what I've found, at least. There are some parts that you just can't buy. For instance, like an original balance wheel with a hairspring, complete. That's it. I mean, that's it. That's either you source that part or you don't. And that's it. And that's why I've put a lot of work actually in the recent years in developing my skill set for hairspring repair, because hairsprings they can very commonly get and easily get distorted from years of use, and particularly if a watch experiences a great deal of shock or something.
Is that still true with modern hairsprings?
It is, so long as those hairsprings are of a sort of a metallic alloy. Now, the silicone hairsprings that are starting to be used, that's less true. Usually they don't bend. They don't
They'll just break.
They'll break. Exactly. So, but there are still lots of hairsprings that are made out of alloy, and those are still susceptible to deformations depending on the activity. And
so you can actually fix that? You don't just replace them?
Yeah, you can fix it.
What do you re-twirl it or something? What do you do?
It's done under microscope, and
geez,
very, very, very fine tweezers and picks.
So you're basically it's like artificially inseminating an egg.
You have to
complicated manual process. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't.
It's very challenging, but once you get the hang of it, you can actually take watches that you would have thought would require sourcing a whole balance complete, something that would have cost, $800 to $1,000 if you can find the part. And
right.
Now suddenly you've managed to avoid having that cost. And I'll just charge for my time on the hairspring adjustment, so, which is, still quite a bit less than it would be to source an entire new balance.
Yeah, I want to say something on this note that I think is so important. There is a very big difference between a mere technician who knows how to fix things and someone who's closer to an artisan who uses what I'll call artistic approaches to repair things. And people have had anything restored understand this, because it's the art of making it look original without necessarily having the original parts. I remember there was a company in Hong Kong. The guy there, Michael, eventually made the brand Undone. He's no longer part of it, I believe. But they specialized not only in vintage Rolex repair, but restoring the bracelets, right? A lot of them would get pulled over time. They weren't made out of solid metal. And this guy, he specialized in being this doctor. Now, he wasn't replacing parts. It was just this artistic approach. And if you sort of get into it, he was, as a kid, made little models and things like that. You could see this progression of skills that led up to this. But this was not something that you could create a whole facility on. This is one guy using his tools that he's assorted, his intuition and his experience, just figuring it out. Because the alternative was finding a replacement bracelet, which it was difficult to do. And so if it wasn't for him learning how to do that restoration skill, it wasn't going to happen. Similar with you, yes, there's a whole community around it, but really you are just trying to invent techniques that allow you to make something old work again or look new or something related to that.
100%. Yes, 100%. The reality is, it's interesting, right? So I've honed a particular skill set in dial repair and hand relooming and color matching of the luminous pigments on the hands.
Oh, hard to do.
Which is, it's not the easiest thing.
Yeah,
I'm not even
paint matching. That's a perfect example. That's an art more than a science.
Yes, exactly. So, somehow I've discovered that I'm good at that. Now my mom is an artist and she was an art teacher for years, and maybe it just sort of, osmosis, just handed down a little bit.
Send your kids to art school, everyone.
Exactly. But it's become something that has really defined my brand, because, the way that I approach that sort of cosmetic repair is not I don't try, I won't fully refinish a dial. I'll usually just touch up a chip, something that's been correct an error that's been made previously by, a careless watchmaker. And that's the way I look at it, is that I'm trying to bring the dial or the hands to a condition that would most accurately represent how they should look if they weren't messed up, And it's funny because sometimes people get hot and bothered by that. They say, oh, well, this is not original. And I say, well, was the mark that was there previous to this original?
Was the wear and tear original?
Right, exactly. Was the hand drag original? No, Rolex never sent a watch out with hand drag on it, So, and usually people stop and they think about it and think, oh, you know what, you're right.
They're kind of obsessed with the whole original thing. I have to, people are so obsessed with that. Boxing papers? Why? The original owner didn't use it, and neither will you.
Exactly. I mean, I get it. I do understand that obviously having original and all original untouched, these things do command a premium, and fairly so. But I think it's also fair for people to want to bring their watches to a condition that makes them happy to look at it, and makes them feel good about their watch, And I think that's the way that I approach it. I look at, is what if this was my watch? How would I want it to look? How would I want it to feel on my wrist? And, looking at errors, looking at dial chips and things to that nature is not, it's not pleasant. So how can we fix that? So to that end too, if I have been asked to do some dial relooms on a rare occasion. And it's usually when the dial has been compromised from like a severe amount of water damage or something to that nature. And if I do, I'll always etch on the back side of the dial, reloomed. Because I do believe there's sort of a responsibility on my part, or anyone's for that matter, that does something like that to be transparent about the work, because there is, a big difference in the premium, the cost of,
And I want to mention that it has been historically common for watchmakers to make small marks, invisible marks on the inside of a case, for example, when repairing something. So that's not damaging it. That's actually for hundreds of years been sort of the respectable way of being like, hey, future watchmaker, just letting you know what happened here.
Sure. Absolutely.
This is a good point to bring up the company you made. You said there was a company related to watch crystals that you made. Yes. Why did you create that? And how easy is it to start manufacturing something like that?
It was not easy at all. In fact, had I known how difficult it was going to be when I first started, I might not have started it. But having done so, I actually am very, very grateful that I've managed to do so. Here's how it came about. First being an enthusiast, specifically of the Rolex Submariner, the vintage subs, I noticed, as many collectors did, that there was a specific type of crystal collectors call a superdome that really had an impact, a very, very distinct visual impact on how the watch is worn and has received and experienced. And in 1980, and somewhere in the 80s, in the early 80s, Rolex changed the profile of that acrylic crystal to something that was much flatter and just had a very different sort of upper radius.
That's also when they started using sapphire in the early 80s.
Yeah, also when they started using sapphire, exactly. And eventually, they phased acrylic out altogether. Now, as a vintage enthusiast, acrylic, I find actually I prefer over sapphire. It has a lot more warmth, charm. There's less sort of smudges that you see on the crystal, et cetera. Things.
And you get to repair it more often.
It's more repair more. Well, that's also the other thing, right? If you get scratches on it, you can just buff them out real quick with polywatch. Whereas a sapphire, you have to actually change the crystal. But in any case, what I've as a collector, I wanted my watch to have an original Superdome, but they were so difficult to find. A lot of times I'd buy one and it would come in and it was aftermarket with like Rolex packaging. So there's a lot of scammers out there and things like that.
Wow.
And I got so tired of that. And so I thought to myself one day, I was like, what if what if I could just reverse engineer an original crystal? What that'd be cool. And then we could be just transparent about exactly what it is. I'm selling it. This is going to be called a true dome. So the idea was that we're, not scamming people. It is exactly what it is, not claiming to be anything. It's not an actual Rolex crystal, but it's paying tribute to what the original one was in as honest and in as accurate a fashion as possible. And it's going to be made of the highest quality acrylic as humanly possible. Everything, because I want it on my watch. This is all about. There's a little selfish at first, No,
that's the best products are done that way. You make the watch for you, and maybe someone else also likes it.
Exactly. So I took on that undertaking, and it actually was a real project, and I'll tell you why. Because acrylic tends to shrink over the years. So in order to get all the dimensions correctly, I had to source new old stock original examples, but they had first of all, they were all a little bit dimensionally different. And a part of that due to the fact that there was a natural acrylic shrinkage. In addition to that, the way that they were manufactured back then was through a process called press molding, and that process does engender a certain degree of variability, inter-item variability. So what I had to end up doing was we would get samples back. They would measure them out through, laser-guided micrometers, all these sorts of things. But invariably, the measurements weren't necessarily on point. So the crystal would come back. I'd get the sample in. I'd mount it on a watch, pressure test it, and it would fail. And then I would have to go back to the drawing board and say, why is this failing? Well, we need the sidewall to be a little thicker here and a little thinner here. We need to adjust the radius here. We need to adjust the offset here. There were so many variables that would go into it. And eventually that reverse engineering wasn't just about cosmetics. It was also about function to make sure that these things did perform as they should as well. So all that to say, it was a back and forth, and our very first model, which was for the Submariner, was called the D19, as I call it. That took about 12 months of R&D and samples and renderings back and forth before we eventually arrived at a product that I was ready to sell and offer.
And was this a acrylics component manufacturer? I'm just trying to, what type of supplier? That's because I'm guessing watch crystals is not what they do regularly.
No, this is it. Watch crystals. This is what.
So they only do watch crystals.
Only watch crystals.
Oh, okay. So then you wanted something special for you. Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
So how do you protect that? Because I know that there's always been a lot of issues. If it's not your manufacturer, they could do out the back end. Maybe that's an advanced level issue, but is that stuff you thought about?
Yeah, I mean, I had all of the companies that I worked with in this respect to do, non-competes, and of course they were happy to do so because I was willing to go the distance and spend 5 figures in R&D and in one piece, one crystal, and that's the other thing that people don't realize. Sometimes I'll get an inquiry, oh, can you make this crystal for me? And I said, well, if you have 12 months and $10,000+ to spend on it, sure. And then usually they realize, okay, that's not going to happen, but you really have to have commitment to it, and really, it's been a few years now that, and now I have several models. I have a few different models for different Rolex references, and it's just slightly turning a profit. It's still really all going back in a lot of times to the R&D because we want to make sure we get everything as exact as possible, and it's not easy. It's really not easy.
And that was going to be my question. This is a significant investment. If you're a business person, you need to anticipate you're going to make your money back at some point. Is there that much repair that needs super domes that this made sense, or is this just like, no, I'm going to do this?
Well, my thinking was this. There's millions of vintage Rolexes out there and that are going to need crystals, if not now, soon, or eventually, someday. And hopefully these collectors are going to want something that they can turn to, that they can trust, that they can enjoy, that maximizes their enjoyment of their watches. And that's what I aim to provide, So will it be profitable someday? I hope so. I hope so. I mean, like I said, we're able to sort of just slightly turn a profit now, which is good. But hopefully someday it'll eventually end up paying off, in larger sums.
I'm sure it will. It sounds like a wise decision. Have you heard yet from Rolex? I know that that's actually often not a good thing because usually they'll send you a nasty note. But in some instances, Rolex does have their own network of restores that they covertly farm work out to because they themselves simply refuse to do a lot of vintage repair. They do a little bit. I'm just curious. You've done a lot of impressive things. Have they said hello yet?
They have not. I think I'd be thrilled if they did. That'd be awesome. Obviously, I'm a fan, but I'm also mindful of the fact that, I don't want to ever claim to be something I'm not. So we're very clear on the website. We are not affiliated with Rolex and or subsidiaries. And
they're touchy about that.
And to that end too, like, I'm very proud to have established the name True Dome. All of my crystals are laser etched with our own, brand markings on the side. So you can't confuse them. They can't be sold as Rolex crystals. That's by design. That's by intention. My aim is always to be transparent and sort of authentic in my approach, to just bring the enthusiasm and high quality to collectors just like myself. Now, if they do that, I'd be thrilled. I'd love it. If there was some opportunity to collaborate with them, God, that'd be fantastic. But who knows what the future brings.
On this note, I want to know, and if you didn't, I recommend you go read it. But several weeks ago, I published an article where I make the argument that watch brands should, in large part, abandon trying to do after-sales repair and a lot of the restoration work themselves as a profit driver, and should return that duty to the sort of large, it's not large anymore, but to a large network of independent watchmakers around the world. About 20, 25 years ago, they started to remove the ability for a lot of independent watchmakers to receive parts. Obviously, this is something you know a lot about, just trying to give some context to listeners. Sure. And their idea was, somebody out there is making a whole lot of money. We'll take that money and we'll offer that service. I argue that didn't exactly work out that well for them. They've had to really increase their overheads by training and hiring a bunch of watchmakers. And that when you went into your typical watchmaker studio, it didn't exactly look like a profit-generating machine. It was like one or two dudes in not the most exciting environment with machines all around them who actually don't charge a lot, right? Like, if you look at it traditionally, watch repair was unbelievably cheap given how much time and effort it would take. I don't know if you saw this or not, but I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on the overall idea of watch brands letting go a little bit, because I think it'll allow for higher quality, faster repair. And I don't think they were making that much money to begin with at it.
I agree with you 100% there. And I think it's an unfortunate reality that, there's this sort of, there's become this desire for these brands to sort of hoard their own parts and not let independents work on them. There's so many watches that I simply can't work on just because I can't get parts for them, and it's unfortunate. I think the independent watchmaking would be much more widespread if that issue didn't exist. And you're right that unfortunately watchmakers, I don't think, are also compensated well, as well as they probably could be. A great example of how things are nowadays, from what I've gathered, at least from my friends who work more so in the industry, with groups, with actual retailers and such, is that basically, you take a company like Tudor, for instance. I've heard, I don't know if I can't verify this is true or not, but I've heard that a lot of their servicing, what happens is those watches will just go in and they basically just swap out the movements for a movement that's working and ready to go, that has either been serviced or is brand new, rather than have it actually serviced by an actual watchmaker. And because it's just cheaper, quicker, and easier, than paying a watchmaker to fully disassemble and reassemble. A lot of times, for instance, these big watch companies will just replace parts rather than try to refurbish them. Hairspring work isn't necessarily getting done in a lot of watchmaking places. The places like Patek, they're just going to replace the balance complete altogether rather than do the hairspring work. Now, maybe at higher levels or for vintage pieces, that's not the case. Maybe that's happening, but from what I've been told, at least, it's not as much.
How do you feel about it? It's a practical decision. It's how the tech companies do things. Tech companies are like, I'm not going to get, there's not going to be a guy with like a soldering iron fixing this. I'm just going to get a new component. So it makes sense time-wise, but does it break your heart? Are you like, send me all the broken movements, please? I want them all.
Yeah, there's a little bit of, I feel like there's a degree of waste to it. It feels haphazard. It feels like there's a bit of lost, a bit of art that's lost in the whole process. And I think that that's kind of sad. It's a bit of a shame.
They definitely don't want to advertise that fact, right? That doesn't increase the sexiness or the sort of allure of their products, right?
Right. Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, I'd be thrilled, and I know a lot of watchmakers would be thrilled if we had easier access to parts. We didn't have to, scour, know certain sources and scour the internet and find these parts, and covert area. It would be nice if everybody just had much easier ability to obtain parts, but.
I have found that a lot of people, very few of them take it as far as you and make a career out of it, but a lot of people are fascinated by watchmaking as a hobby at the very least. But it is, especially in the United States, notoriously difficult to find good watchmaking courses. There are some of those wonderful facilities by Richemont, Swatch Group, Rolex that will train you for free if you get in. But what they train you in terms of watchmaking is iffy. It's more of a technician job. How did you become a watchmaker? And if somebody else in the United States is interested in learning those skills, what would you advise them to do?
So my path was a bit unconventional.
As are most, yeah.
I became friends with he's at this point, I guess, a 40-year plus watchmaker.
So you apprenticed?
Yeah, I did an apprenticeship basically, and I still call him here and there for some advice on something that I've not encountered in the past, but. Basically, that apprenticeship was super helpful. It was really nice. It was a great experience. I also learned sort of through books, my own observations, videos online, through other friends at different places that had graduated through things like Richemont, Patek Philippe, watchmaking schools and such. So I've sort of absorbed a lot of things. And then a lot has just been sort of experience in my own, figuring out my own way around how to do things. My grandfather used to have this phrase that if it's making you mad, you're doing it wrong. And I always try to think about that when I'm working on watches. If I'm getting frustrated, I try to take a step back and say, I must be doing this wrong. How else can I approach this? And usually when I'm able to do that, there's sort of an exercise on mindfulness too, because I learn something new. I learn a new way of approaching something. And that's also been somewhat rewarding. So
now that's wonderful for you that you were able to follow your tenacity interest, find those resources, fortunate enough to find someone that you could even apprentice under. I recommend that everyone out there adopt a watchmaker if you find one. But that's an uphill battle. That's challenging. That forces professionals like yourself to remain highly, highly niche. Should it stay that way? Because there are a lot of watches in the repaired. Is there a business case to be made for having more watchmaking schools and more watchmakers?
I think so, actually. I think that there's definitely a paucity of watchmakers and an abundance of need, and it would be nice to have more sort of attention to watchmaking. I think I try to do that a little bit with my sort of social media outlets on Instagram and YouTube, and people seem to really gravitate towards that stuff and get something out of watching some of the content that I post. Just in general, I think it makes the enthusiasm for watches more, more comprehensive when you're actually able to see sort of what goes on under the hood, so to speak, right? And yeah, I think that absolutely it would be nice to see there be more educational opportunities for watchmaking in, obviously in the States and other places as well. But as long as I think that what's interesting and ironic about this is that as long as I think the larger companies out there still keep making it so difficult for independent watchmakers to thrive, then then you're also potentially you're stuck having to work for a big group like Richemont or something to that nature, and that's not always as luxurious as it could be. So it's again, I think that it's hard for me to really speak to that because my path has been somewhat unconventional. And also I would say this, it does take a lot of money to open your own, sort of studio lab of sorts in watchmaking. And I had the good fortune of having a somewhat thriving practice as a psychologist that I could devote my resources to turning that into a watchmaking studio that would enable me to do a lot of things. The tools that you need are super expensive, and a lot of times, no matter how skilled you are, if you don't have the right equipment, you can't do certain things. So, I had the good fortune of having an income in other ways in order to build up my watchmaking practice. And now the watchmaking thing has become self-sufficient as well. But there was some time there where I was relying on psychology to get me through and to help me build that space. Right.
Now, you mentioned, of course, having this psychology practice as a background, which I think is unique because most watchmakers and technicians do not have a reputation for being particularly social or know how to explain what they're doing and things like that. And the fact that you understand the nuances of how people think and communicating to them, as well as helping them do something. What do you want to say to people that you think is important that the average watchmaker simply wouldn't be able to say? I mean, I think that there's a watchmaking culture out there that is difficult to penetrate unless you're sort of in it. You can straddle both of those worlds. Talk to collectors in the world about the watchmaking culture in a way that most other watchmakers simply can't do.
Well, I think what's interesting, that's a challenging one to answer. I'm going to try my best to do it.
You're representing all of them, Mr. Liaison.
Let me see what I can do with it. One of the things I will say is this. I feel very grateful that I started first as a collector and an enthusiast, because I think that perspective of being a collector and enthusiast first has really shaped the way that I approach watchmaking. It's easy to look at oneself, I think, in watchmaking as a technician, somebody that you just need to get the thing running and running well, right? But in that, sometimes you lose aspects of what makes it exciting for people, which is to say how important the condition of the hands and the dial remains, and the condition of the case remains throughout the whole process of all that. Unfortunately, I've had to correct a lot of errors that previous watchmakers have done in the past on many watches, because they didn't necessarily look at or view the watch that they were working on as something special from a collector standpoint. And I think that having had the collector standpoint first, before going into being a watchmaker, it enables me that ability to sort of maintain that perspective, which helps it be fun. There are times when I go down to my workshop and I'm still like a kid in a candy store. I take the watches out of the safe and I'm look at them all and I'm like, wow, I get to just work on these all, like, this is crazy. I still look at them and I'm like amazed that I can do this. This is awesome. So I would say sort of just trying to make sure that one adopts and maintains enthusiasm for the stuff, right? And then the other thing that I would advise sort of like fellow watchmakers to do is to try the best they can to keep it fun. I think that that's super important. Every now and then I will stop working on client work, even if I'm like have a deadline, I'll stop and I'll work on something for myself, something that I like to do, something that's creative. Sometimes I do these Tudor modifications, and they're just like, I anodized the Tudor Pelagos for myself. I anodized it blue. I took a whole day to like figure out how to electro anodize titanium, and for no other reason than just because I thought it would be interesting and I thought it'd be fun.
You can do that at home. You can make an acid bath and all that stuff.
You can do it at home. Yeah. Granted, you need to fully disassemble the watch because you can't have any steel. You can't have any steel in it. Otherwise it'll mess up the process. But you could do it. It's doable. Wow. Yeah, and I turned a Tudor P39 blue, and that's been fun. And I did it just for myself to have fun and share it with people and keep the enthusiasm. You know what I mean? So when I think about what what I would hope to see other watchmakers do. I guess it's to make sure that they always take some time for themselves, to make sure they work on their own stuff every now and then, and they still try to have fun with it. I think that it's very easy to get caught up in the mindset of, I need to keep doing this, I need to make more money, I need it. But I think it's more important to try to take a step back when possible and try to just have fun with it.
We're about out of time, so I want to ask just one more question, and that has to do with marketing. There's a lot of things that you specialize in. There's certain things that other watchmakers specialize in. Mm-hmm. Though I think on the outside, especially if you sort of run, you have a website, you run your accounts, it can look like you guys all sort of do the same thing. What is your strategy for helping to define, if you are the type of person that needs this type of repair, come to me because this is what I specialize in? What are the ways of doing that in today's marketing channels that are available to you?
I've only really ever used YouTube, and Instagram, and I'm starting to use YouTube. And what I've been doing lately is I'm putting videos together more so than just photo content, but I'm putting videos together that kind of showcase the way that I work and the things that I work on.
That works well on YouTube.
And that really does. It's really nice to do that. I think sometimes watchmakers are a little bit shy about showing their work. And I think it's actually, it's almost sort of obligatory to show one's work and let people feel a certain level of confidence that they can send you their prized watch because you know what you're doing, and if you didn't know what you're doing, you're not going to show it, right? So I'm proud of the work that I do, and I showcase that, and I like sharing that with people. And I think that pride and that enthusiasm sort of is something that people pick up on, and it makes them decide with confidence that they want to send me their watch. And that's really all I do. I don't do any paid advertisements or anything like that. At first, it was just word of mouth, and that worked okay for a while. And actually, I tend to sometimes turn things away if I don't have the capacity to take it in at that point in time. Or if I don't like I'm a little bit of kind of eccentric in that way sometimes. Like if I just simply am not able to get the parts, or if it's a watch that I just know I won't want to work on for some reason or another, I'll refer them out to other watchmaking friends of mine. But I think that because I'm able to just, portray this genuine experience of excitement and enjoyment in what I do, and that I'm proud of the work that I do, and I share it that way, I think people have a sense of confidence that they want to send their stuff over. So that's how I've been doing it thus far.
Greg, thank you so much. We're going to have you back on the show because there's a lot more to talk about, especially with psychology. But the conversation went so quickly. Before we end, use this opportunity just to plug your websites, your channels. Just let people know where they can find you on the internet.
Thanks. Well, first, Ariel, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. People can find me either on my Instagram, which is @true_patina, or my website, truepatina.com. That's it.
This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Dr. Greg Petronzi. Greg, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ariel. Take care.